A wealthy man lost his wife during childbirth and could barely look at his newborn son without breaking down. His kind Nanny watched him drowning in grief, unable to connect with the baby his wife died bringing into the world. What she told him one night changed everything and brought him back from the edge of despair. The mansion stood silent, except for the soft crying of a 3-week-old baby. The sound echoing through rooms designed for joy, but now filled with absence so heavy it felt like physical weight pressing down on everything. In the nursery, Elena Martinez gently rocked baby Michael. Her weathered hands practiced from raising 5 children of her own. Her voice humming lullabies in Spanish that seemed to be the only thing that calmed him when he sensed the grief permeating his home. Down the hallway in the master bedroom, 42-year-old James Davidson sat in the dark, staring at his wife's empty side of the bed, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to do anything but exist in the nightmare that had become his reality when Catherine died, giving birth to their son 2 weeks earlier. James had built a software empire worth hundreds of millions, had achieved every professional goal he'd set. But none of that mattered anymore because the woman he'd loved for 15 years was gone, taken by complications during delivery that the doctors said were unpredictable and unstoppable. He'd been holding her hand when she died, watching life leave her eyes while their son's first cries filled the delivery room, creating an association in James's mind he couldn't break. His son's life had cost his wife's life. A trade he would never have made if given the choice. A reality that made looking at Michael almost impossible without drowning in resentment and guilt and overwhelming grief. Elena had been hired 3 days after Catherine's death by James's sister, who recognized her brother was in no condition to care for an infant while barely functioning himself. Elena was 62. A widow herself who understood grief intimately, who'd raised her own children alone after her husband died young, who brought not just childcare skills, but a wisdom earned through surviving loss that hadn't destroyed her. She'd been watching James carefully, seeing how he avoided the nursery, how he couldn't hold his son without his hands shaking and tears starting, how he was slowly disappearing into grief that would consume him completely if someone didn't intervene. On this particular night, 3 weeks into her employment, Elena found James standing outside the nursery door at 2 in the morning, his hand on the doorknob but unable to turn it, unable to go in and comfort his crying son because being near Michael brought emotions too overwhelming to process. Elena approached quietly, Michael asleep now in her arms after being fed and changed. "Mr. Davidson," she said gently, "your son needs you. I know this is hard, but he needs his father." James's voice came out broken. "I can't. Every time I look at him, I see what it cost to have him. I see Catherine dying. I can't separate him from losing her. It's not fair to him, but I don't know how to feel anything but anger and grief when I'm near him." Elena was silent for a moment, then spoke with the authority of someone who'd earned the right through her own suffering. "Mr. Davidson, may I tell you something? When my husband died, my youngest was 6 months old. I blamed that baby for months. If I hadn't been pregnant, maybe Juan would have been more careful at the construction site. Maybe he wouldn't have taken dangerous overtime to save money for the baby. I looked at my son and saw the reason my husband was gone. It ate me alive until my mother said something that changed everything. She said grief makes us stupid. It makes us blame the innocent and miss what's right in front of us. Your wife didn't die so your son could live. They're not connected that way. She died from complications and your son was born. 2 separate events that happened at the same time. Your grief wants to connect them because blame is easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen." James stared at her, tears streaming down his face. But if she hadn't been pregnant, she'd still be alive. Elena's voice was firm but compassionate. Maybe she would have died in a car accident next year, or from cancer in 5 years. We don't get to know. What we do know is that she wanted this baby. She chose to have him. She loved him before he was born. When you reject him, when you can't look at him without anger, you're rejecting what she wanted most. You're letting her death mean nothing. But if you love him, if you raise him to be happy and good, then her death, as terrible as it is, created something beautiful that continues her legacy. She's in him, Mr. Davidson. Every time he smiles, every word he'll speak, every accomplishment he'll have, she'll be there. But only if you let yourself see him instead of your loss. The words hit James like a physical blow, breaking through the fog of grief that had isolated him from reality. "You blamed your baby?" he asked quietly. Elena nodded. "For months. Until I realized I was punishing an innocent child for my pain, that I was so focused on what I'd lost that I couldn't see what I still had. My son is 30 now. He became a nurse. He saves lives. If I'd let my grief win, if I'd rejected him, I would have missed watching him become someone his father would have been so proud of. Don't make my mistake, Mr. Davidson. Don't let grief steal both your wife and your son from you." James held out his arms, a gesture that cost him everything emotionally, but felt necessary in ways he couldn't articulate. Elena placed Michael gently in his father's arms, the baby stirring slightly, but remaining asleep. James looked down at his son's face for the first time, without the filter of grief, seeing not the cause of Catherine's death, but the result of her love. The child they'd planned together, the future she'd wanted so desperately to see. "He looks like her," James whispered, his voice breaking. "Around the eyes." Elena smiled gently. "He has her expressions when he sleeps. You'll see more as he grows. She's not gone completely, Mr. Davidson. She's in him. But you have to look." What followed wasn't immediate healing, because grief doesn't work that way. But it was the beginning of connection James had been too broken to achieve on his own. He started spending time in the nursery, sitting in the chair while Elena fed Michael, talking to his son about Catherine, telling him stories about the mother he'd never meet, but would know through his father's memories. Elena encouraged this, understanding that healing required James to integrate his grief rather than choose between mourning his wife and loving his son. They weren't mutually exclusive. He could do both. James began taking over some care duties, learning to change diapers and prepare bottles with Elena's patient guidance, discovering that the routine tasks of fatherhood created space where grief could exist without overwhelming him completely. He found that holding Michael actually helped, the weight of his son grounding him in the present rather than the past, giving him purpose beyond just surviving each day. And slowly, over months, James began to see what Elena had seen immediately, that Michael was a gift, not a curse, that his birth and Catherine's death were tragedies that intersected but weren't cause and effect, and that loving his son was the best way to honor the wife he'd lost. Years later, when Michael was 5 and asked about his mother, James found he could talk about Catherine with love rather than just pain, could share stories that celebrated her life rather than focusing only on her death. He credited Elena not just with caring for Michael during those early weeks, but with saving both of them from a grief that could have destroyed their relationship permanently. Elena's wisdom, earned through her own loss, had given James permission to grieve and love simultaneously, to understand that embracing his son didn't mean forgetting his wife, and that sometimes the kindest thing someone can do is tell you hard truths wrapped in compassion when you're too lost to find your way alone.